Steve Smith, a man who carries within himself two lives, one illuminated beneath dazzling lights and another that quietly hides underneath, revealed only in the stillest moments. The drummer who once shook entire stadiums with "Don't Stop Believin" is exactly such a person. The public knows him as the heartbeat of Journey, a rock icon of the '80s. But few realize that behind those blazing drum beats lies a silence difficult to name, a mysterious calling that seemingly only he can hear. People often say that Steve didn't just play the drums with technique, but with a patience that felt almost instinctive. As a boy sitting in a small wooden shed behind his house, he repeated the Muller stroke again and again until even the sky forgot to turn bright. Not out of pressure or ambition, but because of an unending curiosity. Perhaps it was that very curiosity that brought him to Journey's grand stage, and perhaps it was the same force that led him away from it. At the peak of Journey's fame, Steve quietly stepped onto a different path. No noise, no declaration, just an artist pausing before the spotlight, tilting his head as if trying to hear more clearly the sound resonating beneath the clamor of success. From that moment, Steve Smith's story was no longer simply about rock or jazz. It became the journey of a gifted but conflicted soul, a man living between two realms, light and shadow, so he could ultimately rediscover the true rhythm of himself. To understand why Steve Smith could pull himself away from the height of glory, we must trace back to his earliest days, when music was not yet a choice, but merely a strange sensation that quietly crept into a young boy's life. Steve grew up in Whitman, Massachusetts, in a quiet town where even the smallest sounds could stir the curiosity of a sensitive child. At just 2 years old, he received his first drum kit. No one expected anything significant to come from that toy, but for Steve, it opened a new language, a silent form of communication that he absorbed so naturally it often left adults astonished. At 9, Steve began studying drums with Bill Flanagan. The lessons weren't just technical instruction. They opened a doorway into a world where rhythm had a soul. Flanagan recognized a rare persistence in his young student, and Steve discovered that the joy of creating sound could soothe every other kind of fatigue. The small wooden shed behind his house became his private realm. Day after day, Steve sat among the slivers of light filtering through the wooden boards, repeating exercises until time itself seemed to melt away. No one forced him. An inner impulse kept pulling him back to the drums, as though they held an answer he was determined to find. As he entered his teenage years, Steve was no longer simply the kid who played drums well. He joined the school orchestra, played in clumsy yet passionate garage bands, and was even invited to perform with the Bridgewater State College Big Band while still in high school. Anyone who heard Steve play shared the same impression. He didn't drum to impress, but to chase after a sound only he could hear. During that period, another fateful figure entered Steve's life: Alan Dawson, his teacher at Berkeley. Dawson didn't just give Steve exercises and rudiments, he gave him a way of thinking, freedom within form. From Dawson, Steve was introduced to foundational practices he would later describe as a kind of technical ritual, a series of rudimental exercises repeated endlessly, almost like a rudimental ritual. It was through that repetition and refinement that he learned to see drumming as a language with breath, silence, and meaning. Dawson also taught Steve to treat drumming as a form of moving meditation. Every beat, every rest, a conscious decision. These lessons, discipline, stillness, introspection, became the internal compass that allowed Steve to preserve his jazz identity even while standing amid the roar of stadium rock. Alan Dawson was the one who ensured that the noise of rock never consumed Steve's jazz essence. During his student years at Berkeley, Steve began to realize that drumming was not merely about technique or speed. It was a form of breathing, a quiet dialogue between the body and time. The exercises Dawson taught him, from the rudimental ritual to drills demanding absolute balance between the right and left hands, opened up for Steve an entirely different perception of rhythm. He learned to value silence as much as sound, to let himself guide the rhythm rather than be pushed by it, to understand that a single soft, perfectly placed stroke could carry more weight than a cascade of thunderous notes. Gradually, Steve developed his own philosophy. The drum's role was not to fill empty space, but to give that space meaning. He called it the art of keeping life's pulse, something that later helped him stand firm in both roaring rock stadiums and intimate jazz clubs. That philosophy didn't come from a moment of revelation, but from countless silent hours of practice, where Steve learned to listen to himself before listening to the audience. That passion carried Steve from his backyard shed straight into professional life. At 19, he joined the Lynn Biviano Big Band. This was no longer the world of quiet practice. It was the precarious life of night buses, glittering stages ahead and long stretches of loneliness behind. There, Steve learned an artist's first truth. The lights are always bright, but it is the darkness behind them that tests one's spirit. Those restless years forged a resilience no classroom could teach. When the big band's sound faded when he was left alone in an unfamiliar motel room, Steve felt the void music left behind, cold yet oddly inviting. From 1976 to 1978, he toured with Jean-Luc Ponty. If the big band had taught him discipline, Ponty opened the door to a new realm, fusion, where rhythm was no longer bound, but became material for constant reinvention. Night after night, Steve felt liberated. The drums were no longer a tool, but his true voice. Amid those feverish nights, small stages, endless solos, the quiet after long rehearsals, a strange feeling began to emerge. It was as if every step he had taken, every sound he had pursued, was silently guiding him toward an invisible rendezvous. And in those wandering years of fusion, while Steve was still intoxicated with the freedom of improvisation, destiny suddenly carried him to a moment that could change his entire life. 1978. Journey appeared. Journey was a rock machine accelerating to a point where nothing could stop it. They were stepping into their brightest era, on the verge of conquering massive stadiums and becoming the memory of an entire generation. The invitation they sent to Steve opened a door straight into the heart of American popular music. When Steve walked into Journey's rehearsal room, he wasn't just joining a band, he was stepping directly into the pinnacle of a career, a height many drummers spend a lifetime chasing but never touch. From a young jazz musician, he became the beating heart of one of America's greatest rock bands. The following years were like an upward vertical curve. Journey expanded. Their sound grew bigger, sharper, stronger. Album after album pushed the band deeper into the fabric of popular culture. And in every transformation, Steve's drumming remained a quiet yet irreplaceable pillar. Don't Stop Believin'. A song time could not erase. A song that, the moment the drums enter, makes the world seem to hold its breath. No one could have predicted that it would outgrow its era, becoming the most downloaded track in digital music history, sung in bars, at sports games, at weddings, on cross-country road trips, becoming part of humanity's collective memory. And it all began with a single hi-hat hit. Soft, precise, so subtle that if you weren't paying attention, you'd think it was simple. But that pulse, Steve's pulse, is what keeps the song's soul alive. Steve played Don't Stop Believin' with an almost meditative calm. Every beat fell in the right place, steady like a machine-measured heartbeat, as if placed by a hand that had spent a lifetime listening to its own pulse. His drumming was not flashy, yet it held the entire song upright, and it was precisely that restraint that made it timeless. But what no one saw was the quiet fear simmering beneath the peak of his glory. The deeper he followed Journey into greatness, the further he felt from the primal call of jazz. The packed stadiums of tens of thousands, the blazing nights of concerts, the triumphant stories, they were breathtaking. Yet they made the inner divide in him even sharper. One part of him belonged to the blinding light in front of him. The other part still sat in that old backyard shed, tracing the smallest nuances only jazz could reveal. A pinnacle, yes, but also the moment when the cracks inside him began to open. In 1985, Steve left Journey to search for his true voice. To walk away from something so dazzling, one must possess a reason stronger than the light itself. For Steve Smith, that reason was the quiet call of jazz. A call that had been with him since the days he sat in the wooden shed, repeating patterns until his hands went numb. 1983. When Journey was still at the height of fame, Steve did something almost no one else would dare. He formed another band. A small group, no stadiums, no massive resources, just music laid bare. That band was Vital Information. It began simply as a doorway for Steve to breathe amid the pressure of rock. But few knew that this small door would become his true home for the next 4 decades. From the start, Vital Information was different. The group didn't just play jazz fusion, they blended funk, the breath of world music, and the rhythmic contours of Indian music that Steve learned through studying Connacole. Their sound resembled the man himself, belonging to no single genre, yet fully alive in every rhythmic phrase. Their first album, Vital Information, 1983, was a declaration. Steve didn't leave Journey to escape. He left to return. Then came Global Beat, 1988, Ray of Hope, 1996, Come On In, 1998, Vitalization, 2007, Heart of the City, 2017, and most recently, Time Flies, 2023. Each album a new chapter, quiet yet enduring, marking one of the longest-running fusion journeys still alive today. On his path to rediscovering his true voice, Steve not only returned to jazz, he opened the door to another rhythmic world, Indian rhythms, especially Connacole. He didn't study it as an add-on technique, but as if learning a second language. The syllables takadimi, takita, takajonu became the breaths that led him into a new perception of time, where rhythm was not just counted, but spoken, lived. Steve worked with masters like Zakir Hussain and Sandeep Burman, who saw in him a rare respect from a Western drummer toward Carnatic rhythm. Thanks to his persistence and intuition, Steve came to be recognized as one of the few non-Indian musicians who truly understood Carnatic rhythmic structure from the inside, through experience rather than theory, just like the boy who once practiced tirelessly in a backyard shed. From Connacole, Steve carried the Carnatic philosophy into Vital Information, Steps Ahead, his solo projects, and his clinics. The Tala cycles, asymmetric subdivisions, rhythmic modulations, all became inseparable from his drumming, guiding listeners into a rhythmic space that felt circular, elastic, mysterious, and magnetic. Steve was no longer just a rock drummer seeking jazz. He had become a traveler between cultures, a man who carried within him the primal spirit of exploration that had followed him since childhood. From the mid-1980s to the 1990s, Steve delved deeply into the world he once thought he had lost. Steps Ahead, Buddies Buddies, The Jazz Legacy. There, he no longer needed to play loudly. He no longer had to overpower the roar of a stadium. He only needed to speak through his true technique, Muller, finger control, techniques that by then had moved beyond the realm of technique and become a language of their own, a language for which rock never left him enough space to speak. Alongside fusion and his rhythmic journeys infused with the breath of India, Steve also stepped onto another path, quiet but full of responsibility, becoming a keeper of the flame of traditional jazz. This was most evident when he joined Buddy's Buddies, a group made up of musicians who had played alongside the legendary Buddy Rich. Here, Steve was not just performing music, he was engaging in a dialogue with a legacy respected across the entire jazz world. Later, when the group was renamed Steve Smith's Jazz Legacy, his role became even clearer. Steve was not only continuing tradition, but preserving the finest essence of the swing and bebop eras with his own breath. In this project, people saw a different Steve, not the rock drummer who once set stadiums ablaze, but an artist standing between two worlds, one hand holding on to the freedom of fusion, the other protecting the classical soul of jazz. Jazz Legacy was not a side project. It was a quiet affirmation that Steve understood who he was, where he came from, and which rhythm had raised him. When Steve left Journey's bright lights to follow a path few dared to take, the honors began to arrive one after another. 5 consecutive years as #1 all-around drummer in Modern Drummers Readers Poll, Top 25 Drummers of All Time, 2001, Modern Drummer Hall of Fame, 2002. For Steve, at that time, these glories no longer took the shape of dazzling light. They felt like gentle confirmations that he had chosen the right road. Vital Information was not just a band. It was proof that Steve Smith's true self did not live in blazing stadiums, but in the small, deliberate beats he had protected all his life. But Steve Smith's life always seemed to move in strange arcs. Every time he thought he had distanced himself from the stadium stage, some invisible force pulled him back. In 1995, Journey called his name once more. The band reunited with its classic lineup, Steve Perry, Neil Schon, Jonathan Cain, as if time wanted to test how much they had changed. For Steve, the invitation was a profound question. Could he reconcile the two worlds that had once torn him in half, the blazing world of rock and the quiet world of jazz? He returned, not for the light, but because he felt that this time he could step back into Journey as a man who truly understood himself. The result of that reunion was Trial by Fire, 1996, a mature, refined album, highly praised. Steve's drumming was no longer just energy and discipline. It carried the depth that only years of fusion could bring. In that album, people heard not just Journey, but Steve himself, a fuller, more layered version. But fate challenged them again. Just as the album was ready to tour, Steve Perry suffered a hip injury, halting everything at the starting line. All plans fell apart. Hopes for a new era dissolved into mist. In 1998, Journey disbanded once more. Steve Smith left again, his second departure. If the first departure was an escape from unbearable brightness, the second had a different shade, a gentle release, like when one realizes that no matter how beautiful a door is, it may not be the door meant for them. Steve stepped away from Journey, this time not to find himself, but to continue the path he already knew clearly, the path of musical truth. After his second departure from Journey, Steve no longer looked back with regret. He walked forward with the calm of someone who understood the map of his inner world. And that clarity opened a new chapter, broader than any stadium that had ever welcomed him. From the early 2000s onward, Steve Smith embarked on a musical journey only truly free artists can take. A multi-genre path where borders between jazz, fusion, rock, world music, and improvisation no longer existed. He expanded his musical universe by collaborating with Steps Ahead, one of the most influential fusion groups on the planet, where rhythm followed no fixed formula and instead flowed with the musician's immediate emotions. From there, Steve stepped into another territory through his work with Dweezil Zappa, carrying with him the sharp spirit and unpredictable structures characteristic of the Zappa lineage. His path brought him to masters from many different worlds. Tony McAlpine, with riffs like Blades; Marion McPartland, elegant and intellectual; Mike Stern, fierce yet melodic; and especially Hiromi Uehara, the Japanese piano prodigy whose bold musical colors opened new doors for Steve. With Hiromi, he found interactions that were unlike anything before, more challenging, more liberated, and more profound. He no longer stood before tens of thousands as he once did with Journey, yet his world expanded in another dimension, expanded through depth. He traveled across Europe, Asia, and even Latin America, and every stage, large or small, became an intimate conversation between him and his drums, a dialogue only those who truly listened could feel. Alongside performing, Steve began sharing his experience, not as a legend dispensing knowledge, but as a sincere storyteller passing on what had helped him preserve his identity through countless shifts. The Muller technique, finger control, the art of shaping small but meaningful beats, and above all, how to sustain passion without losing oneself. He produced instructional DVDs considered classics by the drumming community, not because they showed off technique, but because they opened a world of awareness, helping young drummers understand that a correct stroke lives not only in muscle, but in spirit. No matter how large the stage, Steve never kept music to himself. Alongside performing, he became one of the most influential educators of his era, a man who carried the flame he had found and passed it on to young hands searching for their own path. He traveled the world during those years, not just to tour, but to stand in small classrooms and in halls resonating with drums, where the lights were softer than in stadiums, yet illuminated the artist's true essence more clearly. Steve was invited to the arenas reserved only for true masters: Drumeo, Zildjian, Pasek, places where every lesson was not just technique, but philosophy. What makes Steve truly different is not the fame of Journey or vital information, but the way he teaches, slow, patient, as if recounting the story of his own survival. His clinics are not classes. They feel like moments in which he opens a door into his inner world, the world of Muller, of finger control, of tiny strokes that carry a vast soul. He did something that made the entire drumming community fall silent. He released the DVD set, Drum Set Technique: History of the U.S. Beat. It was not a commercial product, but a kind of master's handbook, where Steve dissected drum technique while also narrating the history of the American beat with the respect of someone who understands whose shoulders he stands on. Many young drummers admitted they grew up from that DVD. It shaped an entire generation, turning Steve not only into an extraordinary artist, but into a guardian and transmitter of knowledge, a teacher in the truest sense. During this period, recognitions from Modern Drummer kept coming, as if the community wanted to record every milestone of his growth. Best all-around drummer, best fusion drummer. In 2002, he was inducted into the Modern Drummer Hall of Fame. But for Steve, these were no longer the blinding peaks that Journey once represented. These honors felt like quiet markers, confirming that the path he had chosen, a path not in pursuit of the brightest lights, but in search of the essence of music itself, was the right one. From a legendary rock drummer, Steve Smith had become an artist of many worlds, a man whose every drum stroke carried a story of choice, of freedom, and of never losing one's true voice. Those years, teaching, traveling across continents and continuing to write the story of vital information, made Steve believe he had closed the Journey chapter long ago. But fate always knows how to call the names of those who have not truly said their final word. In 2015, the old light returned. Journey, now with a renewed lineup, sent an invitation for Steve to come back a third time. Without the excitement of youth, nor the inner turbulence of his first return, Steve stepped into the band with a different demeanor. Calm, composed, as if he had gained enough experience to stand in a stadium without losing the jazz inside him. This return marked a remarkable phase. Steve and Journey performed live in Japan, 2017, Escape and Frontiers, a concert recreating two legendary albums on which he had originally left his mark. Watching him on stage at Tokyo Dome City Hall, one felt as if time were folding back on itself, but with a man who had grown, understood himself, and knew how to hold the band's pulse without ever showboating. In 2017, when Journey was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Steve Smith stood on that stage as living proof that sometimes the most winding paths lead us back to where we truly belong. Under the solemn lights of the ceremony, he stood beside the classic members, the faces who, with him, had shaped the sound of a generation. When the camera lingered on Steve, one could see in his eyes not only pride, but also a layer of emotion difficult to articulate, as if he were watching a younger version of himself, drumsticks in hand, stepping into Journey's rehearsal room for the first time in 1978. It was a complete moment, one that seemed to close all the rough edges of decades past. Journey continued major tours across the United States and around the world. Stadiums lit up again, and Steve's drumming once more moved tens of thousands of people as if they were a single body. But this time, Steve was no longer consumed by the lights. He held distance, held control, walking between two worlds without letting either devour him. In 2020, the Journey chapter closed, this time for good, and not with a gentle ending, but a cold cut. Steve Smith and Ross Valerie were dismissed immediately after Journey accused them of participating in a corporate coup d'etat, an alleged attempt to seize control of Nightmare Productions, the company that owned the Journey trademark. Statements from Neil Schon and Jonathan Cain asserted that Steve and Ross had held internal meetings deemed unauthorized, allegedly aiming to change managerial personnel to gain control of the Journey name. Everything unfolded within days. No musical dialogue, no artistic disagreement, only lawsuits, legal documents, and a termination letter delivered like administrative paperwork. It was an ending so cold, one could not help but ask, how could an artist who kept time for Don't Stop Believin' leave Journey like this? After more than 4 decades with 3 cycles of departure and return, Steve closed the Journey chapter, not with a final performance, but with a legal memo. It was bitter in a way, but also fitting for the rhythm of his life. Whenever a door closed, it was because he was ready to follow a deeper calling. And this time was no different. Journey receded into the background, and Steve stepped forward onto the only path that had never betrayed him, the path of true music. When the Journey door closed with the cold metallic echo of legal paperwork, the strange thing was that Steve did not fall. On the contrary, the silence after that incident felt like the depth of a rest. Not an ending, but a preparation for a new downbeat, stronger and freer than before. From 2020 onward, Steve Smith returned to the place he had always belonged most deeply: jazz fusion. No longer bound by stadium schedules, no longer forced to negotiate between fame and identity, Steve stepped into the purest artistic phase of his life. Vital Information, the artistic child he had been nurturing since 1983, became the center of all creative movement. The group continued touring internationally: Europe, Japan, South America, places where jazz fusion is not merely heard, but lived. He also reunited with Steps Ahead, a band whose energy always seemed ready to tear apart any rulebook, where Steve pushed himself into non-linear rhythmic structures and improvisations that stretched the soul like a long breath. Alongside that were high-level solo projects, where he dug deeper into molar, finger control, polyrhythm, conical, rhythmic languages that only those who devote their entire lives to the drums can truly understand and speak fluently. With no journey to define him, no rock stage to overshadow him, Steve Smith in this period became his purest, most self-possessed form. And at that very moment, the professional world recognized him with a kind of respect rooted not in rock stardom, but in the most important thing, the pure artistry of a musician holding sticks. Today, even as he approaches 70, Steve is still regarded as one of the greatest drummers alive, not only for his nearly superhuman technique, but for his ability to cross genres, rock, jazz, fusion, world music, while keeping a distinct personal voice in every strike. He's no longer at the center of lawsuits, blazing stadiums, or battles for fame. But in small studios, in jazz clubs where the lights dim gently, Steve Smith shines in the purest way, through music, without needing any nameplate to prove anything. If Journey was the brightest chapter of Steve Smith's life, family was the quietest, and also the most essential chapter that kept him from being swallowed whole by stadium lights. Those who have met Steve off stage often say he carries a kind of calm that's hard to name, as if he has just put down some invisible weight. Perhaps after decades living inside the roar of stadiums, he understood that a person is only truly seen when they come home. Steve married Diane, a woman who has stood behind every major decision of his life, yet rarely appears in the press. Diane is not the loud cheerleader type. She is a soft light, not blinding, but steady. When Steve is on tour, she holds the rhythms of daily life together. When he comes home, she reminds him to eat, to rest, to breathe. Simple things that, for a touring musician, can become salvation. In a rare moment of sharing, Steve once admitted that when his children were young, he often felt he left for too long and returned too late. And it was precisely that feeling that made him, as he entered middle age, value his family more deeply, not as an obligation, but as a place of healing. "The children are grown now," he said. "I don't have to worry about being absent too much anymore." It wasn't a light statement. It was the confession of a father carrying guilt. Guilt for having missed many ordinary moments while chasing the rhythms of the world. Sometimes he would recount returning home after a tour, opening the door, no cheering crowd, no stage, only silence that felt slightly unsettling. Yet in that silence was something no stadium could give him, the feeling of being an ordinary man, not a legend, not the drummer of Journey or Vital Information, just Steve, husband and father. Diane understood that emptiness. She didn't fill it with words, but with presence, the fullness of a home where someone waits. For Steve, that was another kind of rhythm, slow, deep, the kind only those who have traveled too far can truly appreciate. It was family, not fame, that gave him the reason to stop when needed, to be silent when the world was loud, to set the sticks down and see himself clearly again. If Journey is where he became immortal in the public memory, family is where he learned how to return to being human, real, without spotlight, without expectation, without pressure. In his children's laughter, in Diane's gentle gaze, Steve found something neither fusion nor rock could ever give. A rhythm of life that didn't need to be thunderous, only truthful. And it is there, in those seemingly small, peaceful moments, that he preserved the part of himself the stage had nearly swallowed many times. Not something to record on an album, not something audiences see under the lights, but the deepest part of a man who has lived through too much noise, the intact core of his being, suspended between two worlds that have always pulled him in opposite directions: the artist and the family man. When looking back on the path he has walked, it is easy to remember Steve Smith through his most dazzling moments. The opening drum beat of "Don't Stop Believin'," the blazing stadiums, the albums that became part of history. But if we listen more closely, we realize those are only the surface of a much more complex story. The story of a man who spent his entire life searching for the truest sound of himself. From the boy tapping drums in a backyard shed to the artist holding the heartbeat of Journey, from years of wandering through fusion to his final departure from the band amid a cold dispute. Every turning point was like the strong and weak beats that shaped the music of his life. There were passages where he walked in blinding light, others where he moved through the shadows of doubt, and still others where he stood alone, with nothing but his breath and the soft tapping on a drum's rim. Through it all, Steve never lost the thing that made him who he is: perseverance. The strange childhood curiosity, the absolute loyalty to rhythm. He accepted that the artistic path is not always beautiful, but always worth walking. Today, when Steve sits behind a drum kit in a small club, or when he stands teaching a young group of students from around the world, one thing becomes clear: he has returned to his own pulse. A pulse that does not need to be loud, does not need to prove anything, but resonates with the understanding earned from a lifetime of observing, learning, and rising after gentle collapses that outsiders rarely notice. For that reason, no matter how stages change or eras shift, the story of Steve Smith continues to quiet people. Not because he is a legend, but because he shows that every person has a rhythm of their own to follow, a calling only they can hear. The only question is, do we have the courage to follow it to the end? If the story of Steve Smith's two-lived journey made you think or touched something inside you, leave a comment so we can continue the conversation. Don't forget to like and subscribe, not just to support me, but to make sure you don't miss the deeper, more emotional musical stories coming next.